There's a moment, and I know this sounds strange, there's a moment right before something world-changing happens when everything gets very, very quiet. Not quiet like an empty room, quiet like a held breath, like the universe itself leans in, wondering what's going to happen next. I felt that moment on Kathara Station. I was 26 years old, 18 months into my posting as a senior logistics coordinator for the Terran Expansion Authority, and I had seen a lot of things by that point. I'd seen cargo haulers 3 kilometers long docking without a sound. I'd seen alien diplomats who looked like clouds of compressed gas negotiating trade routes with perfect calm. I'd seen engineering crews rewire a fusion relay in zero gravity while eating lunch with their other hand. But nothing prepared me for what I watched happen in Bay 47 on the 3rd Tuesday of October, in the year humanity had finally, officially, become something the rest of the galaxy actually worried about. Let me back up. Kathara Station sat at the intersection of 6 jump lanes, which made it the single busiest trading hub in the Outer Rim cluster. Over 400 species used it daily. There were markets that never closed, docking bays that never emptied, and a constant background hum of 100 different languages being spoken, transmitted, and processed simultaneously. The station was enormous. 32 kilometers from bow to stern, rotating in 2 separate sections for gravity, with a central zero-G core that was frankly terrifying to walk through if you didn't know what you were doing, which most of the new Terran postings didn't. I'd watched a kid from New Boston try to navigate the core on his second day and spend 45 minutes drifting in completely the wrong direction before a maintenance drone gently redirected him. I mention all of this because the scale matters. When I tell you what happened in Bay 47, I want you to understand that Kathara Station was not a small, quiet outpost. It was one of the most trafficked locations in the known galaxy. It had been running for over 600 Earth years. It had seen wars start in its corridors, alliances form over its trading floors, and political dynasties rise and collapse across its docking schedules. The station had seen everything. Except this. My office was on level 14, Section C, which gave me a direct sightline to the main commercial docking ring. I had a window, an actual window, not a screen that looked out over Bay 40 to Bay 52. I'd requested that office specifically when I arrived, because there was something grounding about watching real ships come and go, something that reminded me what the work was actually for. The morning it happened, I was 3 hours into a backlog of docking authorizations that had piled up while the night shift coordinator dealt with a coolant leak in the agricultural transport section. I had lukewarm coffee that tasted vaguely like recycled water and a headache that had started somewhere around hour 2. The first thing I noticed was the silence on the radio band. Not the full station-wide silence I described earlier, just a specific absence on the commercial docking frequencies, a kind of hesitation in the usual chatter. I looked up from my screen. Bay 47 was directly in my line of sight. There was a ship docking there that I hadn't authorized. Now, unauthorized docking happened occasionally. Usually it was a small craft that had miscommunicated its berth assignment, or a pilot who'd gotten confused between the 2 commercial rings. Standard stuff, annoying but manageable. This was not that. The ship settling into Bay 47 was a Vrethian warship. I want to make sure you understand what that means, because the word warship doesn't really capture it, not for a Vrethian vessel. The Vreth were, at the time, considered the most militarily capable species in the Outer Rim cluster. They had been waging wars across 3 sectors for the better part of 2,000 years. They did not lose. They had never, in recorded galactic history, surrendered or retreated from a conflict they had initiated. Their warriors were engineered from birth for combat, faster, stronger, and more durable than virtually anything else that walked on legs. Their warships matched their warriors. The vessel now occupying Bay 47 was a frigate class by Vrethian standards, which meant it was smaller than their main fleet ships. It was still 400 meters long, covered in ablative combat plating the color of dried blood, bristling with weapon systems that were very clearly not in their stored positions. Vrethian ships did not come to trading stations in combat posture. Vrethian ships did not dock at all usually. They had no reason to. They didn't trade. They didn't negotiate through commercial channels. They took what they needed from whoever they wanted, and the galaxy had generally found it easier to let them do that rather than push back. So why was one sitting in my bay? I was already reaching for my comm link when my door opened, and Senior Commander Rella Voss walked in. Rella was the T's head of security for Cathara Station. She was 43, former Navy, and had the kind of calm that isn't actually calm. It's the stillness of a person who has decided that panic is a waste of energy she doesn't have. She had a scar along her left jaw from something she'd never explained, and she wore it the same way she wore everything, like it was simply part of the equipment. She closed the door behind her. "You see Bay 47, she said, not a question. "I see it," I said. "What are they doing here?" "That's what we're going to find out." She sat down in the chair across from my desk without being invited, which was completely normal for Rella. "Get your authorization logs up. I need to know exactly who cleared that berth." "Nobody cleared it. That's an unauthorized dock." She looked at me for a moment. "Okay." "Rella, that's a Vrethian war frigate, in a commercial bay, with active weapon systems." "I know what it is," she said. "I need you to stay calm and pull the logs." I pulled the logs. Nobody had cleared Bay 47 for a Vrethian vessel. The berth had been assigned to a Corellian grain transport that wasn't expected for another 6 hours. The Vrethian ship had simply arrived, positioned itself, docked. Like it owned the place. Which, historically, was kind of how the Vreth operated. The next 40 minutes were the most bureaucratically tense of my career, which is saying something, because I once spent 3 days mediating a trade dispute between a Selthari collective and a Tharvan merchant consortium who had actually purchased a specific shipment of rare earth minerals that was sitting in a disputed hold. Station Director Amara Os convened an emergency coordination meeting in the operations center on level 6. There were 8 of us around the table. Rella, myself, 2 of our diplomatic liaison officers, the chief of station engineering, the head of medical services, and 2 representatives from the Cathara Multi-Species Council who had been summoned, because anything involving a Vrethian vessel technically required council notification. One of the council representatives was a Tharvan named Ovesh Murin, who was approximately the size of a small car, and had a complex system of bioluminescent patterns on his hide that he used for expressing emotion. Right now, those patterns were cycling rapidly between orange and white, which, in Tharvan body language, translated roughly to controlled panic. The other council representative was a Celian diplomat named Preth, who communicated through a translation collar, and whose species' primary emotional response to stressful situations was an almost uncomfortable level of stillness. Preth had not moved in 7 minutes. Director Osai was standing at the head of the table, pulling up the external camera feeds from Bay 47. The Vrethian ship sat there, patient, enormous. Its boarding ramp was down. No one had come out yet. "Options," Director Osai said. She was a short woman, dense with authority in the way that some people simply are, and she said the word like she was handing it to the table to deal with. "We can hail them," one of the diplomatic liaisons said. His name was Jonah Park, and he'd been a diplomatic officer for 12 years and had that professional calm that either comes from training or from having given up on getting emotionally involved in anything. Possibly both. Open comms, request identification, ask for their stated purpose. "We've been hailing them since they docked," Rella said. No response. We could notify the Vrethian hegemony directly. The other liaison, a woman named Cassandra Fenn, suggested. Contact their nearest administrative node. Request clarification on what this vessel is doing in a civilian trading station. Their nearest administrative node is 14 hours away by conventional comms, Rella said. And the Vreth don't generally respond to civilian inquiries at the administrative level. Then we wait, Oveshmurin said, his bioluminescence settling into a slow, deep pulse that I recognized as resigned acceptance. The Vreth do nothing without purpose. They are here for something. Eventually they will tell us what. And in the meantime, Director Osai said, we have an active warship with unmothballed weapons systems sitting in a commercial docking bay that was supposed to receive a grain transport in 6 hours. I can reroute the grain transport, I said. Everyone looked at me. The Corellia grain transport. I can redirect it to Bay 51. Buy us some space. Director Osai nodded once. Do it. What else? I've quietly moved all non-essential personnel from the 40 to 50 range to other sections, Rella said. Maintenance access is restricted. I've pulled 3 of my security teams to positions in Section C, 2 levels up from the bay, not visible from the dock, just present. And our Terran military liaison, Director Osa asked. Rella paused for just a fraction of a second. Lieutenant Commander Declan Ward is aware of the situation, she said. Something in the way she said it made me look at her more carefully. How aware? Director Osa asked. Very, Rella said. I should tell you about Declan Ward. The Terran Expansion Authority maintained a small military detachment at Cathara Station, 12 personnel, officially designated as a Security Advisory and Emergency Response Unit. It was, in the diplomatic language that the Multi-Species Council had agreed upon, a non-combat presence, a formality, a gesture toward the station's relationship with the T. That was the official position. The reality of Declan Ward was somewhat more complicated. He was 34 years old, 6'2", built like someone had assembled him specifically for the job of being in situations where you wanted the most dangerous-looking person in the room to be on your side. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, which on him looked less like aging and more like intentional intimidation. He had steady gray eyes that looked at everything the same way, the view from my office window, a diplomatic crisis, a cup of bad coffee with the same unreadable attention. He'd done 3 deployments in the frontier conflicts, which was what the T officially called the series of engagements along the expansion boundary, where humanity had first started running into species that weren't happy about us being there. He'd been decorated 4 times and had filed reports that were, according to the gossip that circulated among the station staff, still classified at levels that most of us didn't have clearance to acknowledge existed. He drank his coffee black, and he never raised his voice, and he had, in the 18 months I'd been on Cathara Station, made me feel simultaneously completely safe and very slightly unnerved at all times. When Rella said he was very aware of the Vrethian situation, I understood that she had already talked to him, that he had already assessed it, that whatever was going to happen next had already been, in some sense, accounted for in whatever mental model Declan Ward maintained of threats and responses. I found that both reassuring and terrifying. The meeting wrapped up with no concrete action plan beyond monitor and wait, which was, honestly, probably the right call. You don't push Vrethian vessels. That much was universally understood. What happened next, nobody predicted. Not the council, not Director Osei, not Rella. Not me. I went back to my office. I rerouted the grain transport. I sat at my desk and watched Bay 47. At 14:32 station time, the boarding ramp of the Vrethian frigate shifted. I leaned forward in my chair. A Vrethian warrior stepped onto Cathara Station. Then another. Then another. I counted 12 of them as they descended the ramp. They were in full combat configuration armor that was part grown, part engineered, dark red-black plates layered over a framework that moved with unsettling fluidity. They were tall. Most Vrethians were between 7 and 8 feet, but these were larger. They moved with the kind of deliberate, heavy confidence that comes from absolute certainty about your place in a given situation. The lead warrior was the largest. He wore markings on his shoulder plates that I recognized from station intelligence briefings as indicating high rank. Not just a commander, a Kethvrau, a war chief. The kind of rank that meant this individual had personally won enough combat classifications to be considered a living weapon under Vrethian law. His name, I later learned, was Garrick Stometh the Unbroken. He had never lost a single engagement in 40 years of warfare. He walked into Kethara Station like he was inspecting something he was considering purchasing. The 12 Vrethian warriors moved through the commercial level below my window in a formation that was clearly military, a diamond, with Garrick Stometh at the front and 3 flanking pairs extending back. They were not running. They were not aggressive. They were simply moving, with the complete confidence of beings who had never, in their entire lived experience, encountered a situation where confidence was not appropriate. The commercial level scattered around them. I watched merchants from 6 different species suddenly find urgent business elsewhere. A pair of Selthari traders who had been arguing about container weights fell silent mid-sentence and walked briskly in the opposite direction. A maintenance crew of Tharvan workers doing repairs on a cargo loading arm collectively decided that the arm could wait. The Vrethians moved through the space they created with no acknowledgement that the space was being created for them. My comlink chimed. It was Rella. They're heading for the main administrative corridor, she said, specifically toward the T-sector offices. Our offices, I said. Your offices, she confirmed. Get out of your office, Vasquez. What? Not for safety reasons. Get out and go to the corridor. I want eyes. You have cameras. I want human eyes, she said and disconnected. I sat there for a moment, considering this instruction. Then I picked up my station comm, tucked it in my jacket pocket, and went out into the corridor. Level 14, Section C ran for about 400 meters in a gentle curve that followed the station's outer ring. The T administrative offices occupied most of the curve: logistics, diplomatic liaison, engineering coordination, and the small suite of offices allocated to the military detachment at the far end. I positioned myself near the junction of Section C and the main transit hub, which gave me a sightline down most of the corridor, while also giving me access to 2 different side passages if I needed to be somewhere else very quickly. I'd been there maybe 3 minutes when I heard them. You couldn't mistake the sound. The Vrethian combat armor had a resonant quality, not mechanical, more like bone and composite material under tension, a faint harmonic that traveled ahead of them like a warning. I'd read about it in the briefing files, but reading about it and hearing it were 2 different experiences. They came around the junction, 12 of them in that same tight diamond formation, and for a moment I had the very clear and specific thought that I was standing in a corridor with the most dangerous soldiers in the outer rim cluster walking directly toward me, and I had absolutely no exit plan. Then I processed what I was actually seeing. They had stopped. The entire formation had stopped, maybe 30 meters down the corridor from me. Because at the far end of the corridor, at the entrance to the T military detachment offices, Declan Ward was standing there. He was not in armor. He was in his duty uniform, the standard T gray and black, the kind of thing you wore to administrative briefings and station meetings. He had his arms loose at his sides. He was standing with his weight balanced and easy, the way people stand when they are either completely relaxed or have trained themselves to look that way. He was alone. The 12 Vrethian warriors had stopped 30 meters from him. Garrick Stometh, the Kethvrouw, the war chief who had never lost, stood at the point of the diamond and looked at this single human man in his administrative uniform. And something happened that I cannot fully explain even now. The Vrethian formation paused. Not for a second or two, not the kind of pause that means calculating next action. A longer pause, a pause that had weight to it. I need to give you some context here, because the pause won't make sense without it. The Vreth had encountered humanity 12 years before this moment. Their first contact with us was at a place called the Thresh Passage, which was a narrow jump lane corridor in the outer expansion boundary. A Vrethian raid fleet, 42 vessels, had come through the passage expecting to find, at worst, a light tea patrol. They found the 12th Border Fleet. I'm not going to recount the full engagement, because that's a whole other story and I wasn't there. But the outcome was this. The Vrethian raid fleet lost 29 ships in 6 hours. The Tea fleet lost 3. The Vreth withdrew, they regrouped, they analyzed, and they came back 8 months later with twice the force. They lost again. Not catastrophically, not like the first time, but they lost. And then they did something that, in 600 years of recorded Vrethian history, they had never done before. They stopped. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic repositioning. They stopped. They sent no further fleets into expansion space. They did not acknowledge the boundary. They simply ceased engaging with humanity as a military target. The galactic diplomatic community spent 18 months trying to figure out what that meant. There were theories. The Vreth had identified a more profitable conflict elsewhere. They had reached some internal political conclusion. They were preparing a larger assault. The simplest explanation, the one that nobody with any kind of academic credential wanted to put in writing, because it seemed too clean, was that the Vreth had done the math, that they had run their models and their simulations and their tactical projections, and come to a conclusion that their entire culture had never had to reach before. That this was not a fight they were going to win. Not immediately, not eventually. Because humans, unlike virtually every other species they'd encountered, didn't fight to survive. They fought to win. And the difference between those two things was, apparently, more significant than the Vreth had anticipated. I knew all of this. It was in the briefing files. It was in the historical record. What I did not know, what none of us knew, really, in the way that you know something when you're standing in a corridor watching it happen, was what that assessment looked like from the other side. What it looked like from the Vrethian perspective to stand in front of a human soldier and feel that old, reliable certainty, the certainty that had carried them through 2,000 years of warfare, hesitate. I think that's what the pause was. Not fear. The Vreth did not feel fear the way we do, but something adjacent, something evolutionary and very, very old. Recalibration. Garrick Stometh spoke. His translator collar rendered his voice as a low, resonant baritone. The Vreth language had been partially decoded by T-linguists, but the full nuance of it still required translation technology, and some things didn't translate cleanly. "You are the garrison commander," Garrick Stometh said. "I am," Declan said. "You stand alone." "I do," Declan said. Another pause. "We have come to discuss terms," Garrick Stometh said, "regarding the Denvith corridor." I almost choked. The Denvith corridor was a contested jump lane in the midrim, currently under T administrative control following a boundary agreement that the Vreth had contested before their abrupt disengagement from expansion space 2 years earlier. They were here to negotiate. Garrick Stometh the Unbroken, who had never lost a battle, who led 12 of his warriors into a trading station in full combat configuration, was here to negotiate. Declan Ward nodded once. "The meeting room is at the end of the corridor," he said. "I'll need to notify station administration that you're here. Give me 5 minutes." And then, and this is the part that I think about still, because I'm not sure I've fully processed what I watched, Declan turned around and walked back toward his office. His back to 12 Vrethian warriors. Just walked away. As if the thought that they might do anything while his back was turned had not occurred to him, not as a calculated display, not as a tactical choice, but because it actually hadn't occurred to him. Because it was simply irrelevant. And Garrick Stometh watched him go. And did nothing. I found out later, from Rella, who had, of course, been watching every second of this through the corridor cameras, that Declan had calmed her from his office during those 5 minutes and told her to notify Director Osai, set up the meeting room on level 14, request a translation protocol upgrade from station systems, and get someone to bring coffee. He had also, apparently, asked her to make sure nobody did anything dramatic while he was getting the room ready. Rella had said, "Are you serious right now?" And Declan had said, "Very. Tell Vasquez to stop hovering in the corridor too. It's not a great look." I had not realized he'd seen me. The next 3 hours were the strangest of my career. Director Osai handled the actual negotiation, with Jonah Park and Cassandra Fenn as diplomatic support and a multi-species council observer sitting in the corner, and clearly trying to process everything happening at a speed his translation collar couldn't quite keep up with. Declan Ward sat to the right of Director Osai, not saying much, occasionally answering direct questions with the same level, unhurried calm he applied to everything. Garrick Stometh sat across the table. They'd had to bring in a different chair from the cargo supervisor's office, because the standard conference chairs weren't designed for a 7.5-foot armored warchief, and his 11 warriors stood around the perimeter of the room. The Vrethian warriors did not relax their combat posture the entire time, but neither did they escalate it. They stood there in full armor and watched humans negotiate with their commanding officer, and the thing I noticed, standing just outside the conference room with a clipboard I didn't need and absolutely no legitimate reason to be there, was that their attention kept coming back to Declan. Not to Director Osai, who was running the meeting, not to the diplomatic officers who were doing the complex work of bridging the actual language gaps and negotiating the specific boundary terms. To Declan, who was just sitting there, listening, occasionally looking at the Vrethian warriors with that same level attention he gave everything. I think, and I've thought about this a lot since, I think they were trying to figure out what he was. Not who, what. Because the Vrethians had a comprehensive understanding of military hierarchy. They had spent 2 millennia studying every civilization they encountered, cataloging strengths and weaknesses, identifying command structures. They knew what a garrison commander was. They knew what the rank meant. What they couldn't reconcile, what I think genuinely unsettled Garrick Stometh in a way that his combat training had no framework for, was the stillness. The complete, unperformed stillness of a human soldier who was sitting in a room with 12 of the deadliest warriors in the galaxy and was not managing fear, because there was no fear to manage. Not bravado, not performance. Just absence of the thing that every other species they had ever encountered carried into a room with Vrethian warriors. The agreement they reached that day was, in the context of galactic politics, a relatively minor thing. A formal acknowledgement of the boundary arrangement in the Denvith corridor, with a modified inspection protocol that gave Vrethian trade vessels. They had trade vessels. It turned out that they preferred the rest of the galaxy not think too hard about passage rights through 2 specific lanes. It was the kind of mid-level administrative agreement that gets filed and processed and doesn't make the news feeds. but the fact that it existed at all, that the Vreth had come to a trading station, through commercial docking, with no prior notification, to sit across a table from human administrators and negotiate a boundary agreement. That was the thing. That was the shift. Oveshmurin, the Tharvan Council representative, came to find me afterward in the logistics office. He was, for a Tharvan, remarkably direct. His bioluminescence had settled into a deep, steady blue, which I'd learned over 18 months meant he was thinking very carefully about something. "The Vreth do not negotiate," he said. "They just did," I said. "Yes," he said. "I need you to understand what that means. The Vreth have been waging active conflict across 3 sectors since before my species had writing. They have never, in that entire history, come to a table without winning everything they wanted at the table or walking away to take it by force instead." "I know," I said. "They sat across from Director Osai," Oveshmurin said, "and they agreed to terms." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "It was him," he said. "Declan," I said. "The soldier, standing in the corridor." Oveshmurin's bioluminescence shifted through something complex. I couldn't read it exactly, but it felt like the colors you see when someone is working through something that surprises them. I reviewed the corridor footage. He had no weapon visible. He made no threat. He simply stood there. "Yes," I said. "And they stopped," Oveshmurin said. 12 Kethvrau-ranked warriors. They stopped. They did." Another pause. "I have been a Kethara Council representative for 19 years, Oveshmurin said. "I have seen the Vreth twice before. In both cases, the council chamber was evacuated. I was told both times that the appropriate response to the Vreth entering a space was to be elsewhere." He looked at me with the 4 gold-rimmed eyes that Tharvans had, and in them was something I could only describe as recalibration. "What are you people?" he said very quietly. I didn't have a great answer for him. Part 2. The weight of a reputation. The thing about Kethara Station, and this is something that takes a few months to really feel, living and working there, is that it has layers. The official layer is the one you see in the brochures, if trading stations had brochures. A model of multi-species cooperation, a hub of commerce and diplomacy, a triumph of the modern galactic community. 14,000 beings of over 400 species going about their business in something approaching mutual tolerance. The real layer is more complicated. The real layer is a place where reputations travel faster than ships, where every species carries its history into every interaction, where the balance of who is afraid of whom, and who respects what is constantly shifting and always felt, even when it's not spoken. After the Vrethian negotiation, I started noticing the second layer differently. I had been on Kethara Station for 18 months before that day. I had been aware, in an abstract way, that humans occupied a particular position in the station's social ecology. We were newcomers, relatively speaking. The T's expansion into the outer rim had only really started 22 years earlier, and we had been on Kethara for 9 of those years. By the standards of species like the Tharvan and the Selthari, who had been part of the station's community for centuries, we were children. But we were children who had done something at the Thresh Passage, and at a dozen other engagement points along the expansion boundary, that had very quickly changed how the rest of the station's population thought about us. Not uniformly, not simply. More like the way a new piece of information changes the way you look at something you thought you understood. I started paying attention to the small things after the Vrethian negotiation. The way a Selthari trader would make room when a T officer walked through the commercial level. The extra margin of space that would appear around the military detachment offices during busy hours. The way certain conversations would pause in the direction of any human who walked past, not aggressively, not fearfully, but attentively. Like we were something that deserved attention. I mentioned this to Preth, the Celian diplomat who served on the Multi-Species Council. Preth had, over the course of my time on the station, become something I would cautiously describe as a colleague. Our work overlapped often enough that we had regular meetings, and Preth was one of those beings who you could have a genuine conversation with rather than a carefully constructed diplomatic exchange. Preth communicated through a translation collar that rendered their speech in a light, precise tenor. They were about my height, very thin, with large reflective eyes and a posture that always suggested deep consideration. "You are noticing the adjustment," Preth said, when I described what I'd been observing. "What adjustment?" "The one that began at Thresh Passage and has been ongoing since." Preth tilted their head slightly, which for a Celian was a gesture of careful thought. "Before Thresh, humans were an unknown, an expansion species with a short history and no established pattern. The galactic community has encountered expansion species before. Most of them reach a certain threshold and stop, limited by resources or technology or internal conflict or the political complexity of managing a multi-world civilization." "And we didn't stop," I said. "You did not stop," Preth agreed. "And then at Thresh you demonstrated something else. That we could fight." "That you could win," Preth corrected gently. "Many species can fight. Very few consistently win against opponents who have been fighting longer." I thought about that, and that's why they give us space. "It is one reason. The other reason is more subtle." Preth paused. "Your soldiers do not behave as soldiers from other species do." "How do you mean?" "Soldiers from most species, even excellent soldiers, well-trained and experienced, carry something. Attention, a vigilance. It reads differently in different species, but it is recognizable. The readiness for conflict that comes from understanding that conflict is possible." Preth looked at me steadily. "Your soldiers do not carry this the same way." "We're not expecting conflict here," I said. "No," Preth said, "but that is not the distinction I am making. The distinction is not about expectation. It is about orientation." Another pause. "Your Lieutenant Commander Ward in the corridor with the Vrethian formation. What about him?" I reviewed the footage with Director Osai's permission. I watched it several times, and I could not identify the moment where he made a decision. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Every encounter between beings who might harm each other has a decision moment. The moment where the individual calculates, consciously or not, whether this situation requires them to prepare for harm. That decision changes the body, changes the posture, the breathing, the focus of the eyes. It is very small, but it is there." "And you didn't see it in Declan?" "I did not see it," Preth said. "And neither did the Vrethians." "Because he wasn't making that calculation," I said slowly. "Because he was not," Preth agreed. "And to the Vreth, who have spent 2,000 years reading that moment in every opponent they have ever faced, its absence is extraordinary." I thought about that conversation for a long time. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to understand something about what humanity had become in the 12 years since the Thresh Passage engagement. Not just in the military sense, but in the galactic ecological sense. We had arrived in the Outer Rim as a newcomer species, and we had been assessed by every civilization that encountered us in the framework that civilizations use to assess newcomers. How much threat do they represent, and how much can we benefit from or exploit their presence? And most newcomer species, when they realize they're being assessed this way, respond with some combination of two strategies. Either they make themselves seem less threatening, smallness, deference, careful non-aggression, or they make themselves seem more threatening, military posturing, diplomatic aggression, explicit demonstrations of capability. We had done neither. We had just arrived, expanded, built, traded, defended when attacked, pursued when engaged, negotiated when it made sense to negotiate. With, apparently, A complete absence of the existential anxiety that most species carried about their place in a galaxy full of other civilizations who might want what they had. And that absence, that particular quality, that calm, had somehow communicated something to every species we encountered that 1,000 years of military posturing couldn't have said as clearly. We were not afraid of this place. Not because we were naive, not because we hadn't assessed the threats, but because, at some fundamental level, the collective human psyche had looked at the galaxy and thought, yes, there are things here that could hurt us, and they will not. Not forever, not ultimately. Because we don't stop. And every civilization that had encountered us long enough had, on some level, understood that. 3 weeks after the Vrethian negotiation, something else happened that I need to tell you about. It started small. There was a species on Cathara station called the Rithari. They were, I want to be precise here because I have some complicated feelings about what happened and I want to be fair. They were a difficult species to work with. Mercantile in the extreme, territorial about trade lanes, and with a cultural tradition of viewing commercial relationships as zero-sum. For them to gain, someone else had to lose. They had been on Cathara station for 60 years, and in that time they had accumulated a significant commercial presence. Several dozen permanent stalls in the main trading floors, a number of warehouse contracts in the cargo sections, and an administrative relationship with the station management that had been carefully maintained through a combination of fees and, reportedly, gifts that never appeared in official station accounts. The Rithari had not been welcoming to the T's arrival on Cathara 9 years earlier. Human traders competing in their lanes, human logistics operations overlapping with their warehouse contracts. This was, to the Rithari, a direct threat to their commercial position, and they had responded to it with a sustained campaign of interference that was just subtle enough to never quite rise to the level of actionable complaint. Containers misrouted, scheduling conflicts that always fell in our favor when Rithari interests were present, trade documentation that arrived in the wrong format or with missing verification stamps that required reprocessing that cost time and credits. I had spent 18 months dealing with this. Every logistics coordinator who'd held my position before me had dealt with it. We documented everything, filed the appropriate complaints through station management, and generally accepted it as a cost of operating in a space that someone else had been working for 60 years before we arrived. What happened 3 weeks after the Vrethian negotiation changed this. The incident started in Warehouse Section G, which was in the cargo ring of the station, a different section from the commercial level, several kilometers away from the T administrative offices. It was a busy area, full of the massive automated systems that moved cargo between ship holds and station storage, and on any given shift there were hundreds of workers from dozens of species operating in close proximity under time pressure. A T cargo crew, 8 people, 5 humans and 3 Selthari who worked contracted shifts for us, had been assigned a pickup from Bay G14. It was a scheduled pharmaceutical transfer, time-sensitive, with a delivery window that didn't have a lot of slack. When they arrived at Bay G14, they found the bay occupied by a Rithari warehouse crew offloading a shipment of their own goods. This was not unusual. Bay scheduling conflicts happened. The appropriate response was to contact station scheduling, document the conflict, and either wait for the bay to clear or request a reassignment. What was unusual was what happened when the T crew supervisor, a human woman named Petra Kang, who was 28 and had been doing logistics operations for 4 years, and was, by all accounts, extremely good at her job, walked up to the Rithari crew chief to request they confirm their bay assignment so she could document the conflict. The Rithari crew chief, whose name translated roughly as Vessel of Fortune Rien, which was a Rithari naming convention that took some getting, used to, told Petra Kang that the bay was his, and she could go file her complaint anywhere she liked, and he'd be finished when he was finished. This was rude, but also not unusual. The Rithari were generally rude in their commercial interactions. Petra noted it, sent a scheduling request to station management, and told her crew to wait. Then the Rithari crew chief called over 2 of his larger crew members and told Petra Kang that if she submitted a scheduling complaint, there would be consequences. I want to be precise here again. This was a threat, implicit, framed in commercial language, but clear. The Rithari had done this before, not to me personally, but to other T personnel. The pattern was threaten, then follow through on the threat in ways that were always just ambiguous enough to argue about. Petra Kang said, noted, and submitted the scheduling complaint anyway, because she was good at her job and not the kind of person who folded on documentation requirements because someone was rude to her. 20 minutes later, when her crew were still waiting, one of the Rithari crew members, not the chief, one of the larger ones who had been positioned nearby, moved a cargo pallet directly in front of the passage that Petra's crew needed to access when the bay cleared. Deliberately, slowly, making eye contact with Petra the whole time. It wasn't violent, it was obstruction, a test. What happened next was what I want to tell you about. I know what happened next because I was there. Not because I was watching. Because Petra's supervisor, that was me, had gotten her scheduling complaint flagged by station management with a note that said Rithari involvement, recommend coordinator awareness, which was station management's way of saying heads up, this might get complicated. I'd gone down to Section G to assess the situation. And I was standing with Petra's crew, looking at the cargo pallet blocking the access passage, and Petra was beside me, calm and professional, when I heard footsteps behind us. I turned around. Declan Ward and 2 of his security personnel were walking toward us. I had not called him, I didn't know who had. Later, Rella told me, he had a standing alert on any incident involving T personnel in the cargo sections. That he'd seen the scheduling conflict flag and made his own assessment. He walked up to where we were standing, nodded at Petra, and looked at the cargo pallet and then at the Rithari crew chief. The Rithari crew chief was about 60 meters away, standing with his larger crew members watching us. He was, I could see this clearly from where I was standing, not concerned. The Rithari didn't have a strong prior on human military personnel. They dealt with the T Security Advisory Unit before, and in their experience, T security personnel were just another version of station security, bureaucratic, process-bound, fundamentally non-escalatory. Declan looked at the cargo pallet for a moment. Then he walked over to it. He was wearing his standard duty uniform. No armor, no visible weapon, same as in the corridor with the Vrethians. He walked over to the cargo pallet and looked at it the way you look at something that needs to be moved. Then he bent down and moved it. Not with effort, not dramatically. He just moved it out of the way you'd move a chair that someone had left in a doorway. Then he walked over to the Rithari crew chief. I couldn't hear what he said. I was too far away and the cargo section was noisy, but I could see the conversation. It lasted approximately 90 seconds. Declan talked. The Rithari crew chief listened. Then Declan stopped talking. The Rithari crew chief looked at him for a moment. Then he told his crew to finish up and clear the bay. They were gone in 12 minutes. Petra's crew made their pickup with 40 minutes to spare on the delivery window. I caught up with Declan on the way back to the administrative section. What did you say to him? I asked. Nothing interesting, Declan said. He moved his entire crew out of a bay they'd been occupying for an hour in 12 minutes. Declan said, that's not nothing interesting. He walked for a few steps in silence. I explained the documentation trail, he said eventually. The scheduling conflicts, the misrouted containers, the communication failures, all of it, pulled it up on my comm and showed him, and I told him it was going to stop. That's it. That's it. And he just agreed. Declan glanced at me sideways. He's a businessman, he said. He calculated whether the cost of continuing was worth it. And it wasn't. It wasn't, Declan said. Something in the way he said it made me press further. Why not? We've been filing complaints for 9 years. Station management has been noting and filing for 9 years. What's different now? A pause. We walked another few meters. Nothing's different, Declan said. The documentation is the same documentation. The complaints are the same complaints. The Rithari's assessment of the cost-benefit is the same assessment. He paused again. What's different is that I showed it to him. I thought about that for the rest of the day. What was different about Declan showing it to him? Not what he said, not any threat he made, just who was doing the showing, what they represented. What the Rithari crew chief's very rational, very mercantile mind had calculated when he looked at the documentation, and then looked at the person showing it to him. And I thought about Garrick Stometh in the corridor, 12 warriors and a warchief who had stopped. And I thought about what Preth had told me, about the absence of the decision moment, about a particular kind of stillness that other species could apparently read clearly, even when they couldn't articulate what they were reading. I think I started to understand it, somewhere in there. Not the politics of it, not the military analysis, something simpler. The reason the Vreth had stopped coming, the reason the Rithari had cleared the bay. The reason that, on Cathara Station and across the outer rim and along every boundary of the Terran expansion, species that had been fighting each other and exploiting each other and carefully calculating every advantage for centuries had started, adjusting, when humans were in the room. It wasn't our weapons, it wasn't our military record, it wasn't even the Thresh Passage exactly. It was that we didn't need it to be enough. Every other civilization in the galaxy was, at some level, managing the fear that they might not be enough, might not be strong enough, numerous enough, technologically advanced enough to hold on to what they had in a galaxy full of other civilizations competing for the same resources. We had looked at that fear and not dismissed it, not overcome it, just not particularly organized ourselves around it. And that, apparently, communicated something that all the military hardware in the fleet couldn't. Part 3, The Gathering. 7 months after the Vrethian negotiation, something happened that took everything I've described and multiplied it by a factor that still, honestly, makes my head swim when I think about it. I need to give you some background. There is a tradition among the older species of the galactic community, the ones who have been operating at interstellar scale for centuries, called the convening of status. It doesn't translate perfectly into English. The closest approximation is something like a gathering of dominant parties to establish order of precedence. Every 50 years, representatives of the species with the largest territorial holdings and military capacity in a given cluster meet to formally acknowledge the current balance of power. It's not a fight. It's not a negotiation exactly. It's more like a formal acknowledgement, the equivalent of everyone agreeing to agree on who's who before going back to the complicated business of actually dealing with each other. Cathara Station had hosted the Outer Rim convening 3 times in the past 150 years. It was considered a neutral venue, old enough, established enough, multi-species enough that no single party felt disadvantaged by the location. The convening scheduled for the year of the Vrethian negotiation was supposed to be a 5-party gathering: the Vreth, the Tharvan Collective, the Selthari Commonwealth, the Myrethian Alliance, and for the first time the Terran Expansion Authority. We had been formally invited, for the first time, because, in the 50 years since the last convening, the balance of the Outer Rim cluster had shifted enough that a convening without the T was considered incomplete. That was the official version. The unofficial version, which I got from Preth over one of our working lunches, was more pointed. The other parties are not certain whether they want to include you, Preth said, or whether they have a choice. There's a difference, I asked. Significant difference, Preth said. If they want to include you, it implies that you are useful allies in the balance they are managing. If they have no choice, it implies something else. That we're one of the dominant parties, and leaving us out would be inaccurate. Precisely, Preth said, and that is a conversation that several of the established parties are finding difficult to have. I thought about this, the Vreth included. Particularly the Vreth, Preth said, including a species in the convening that fought your forces twice and chose not to continue engaging. That is a specific kind of diplomatic acknowledgement. It has weight. It had weight. That was, I thought, one of the more diplomatic understatements I'd heard in 18 months on a station full of diplomats. The convening was scheduled for 3 days and was set to take place in the station's Level 2 ceremonial hall, which was the largest single interior space on Cathara. It had been used for 3 previous convenings and several major diplomatic summits, and had the kind of architecture that was clearly designed to make everyone in it feel that whatever they were doing there mattered. Preparing for it was the most complex logistics operation I had managed since arriving on the station. The security protocols alone required 3 separate sets of permissions from 3 different council bodies. The translation systems needed upgrades to handle 7 distinct primary languages plus their subdialects and formal registers. The catering requirements, and I mean this genuinely, catering is a genuine diplomatic concern at multi-species events, because getting someone's atmospheric or nutritional requirements wrong is both a health emergency and an insult. The catering requirements took a full week to coordinate. Rella was a constant presence in my office during that week, which I chose to interpret as a positive sign about the security situation rather than the alternative interpretation. How many military personnel are we talking? I asked her on the Tuesday before the convening. From all parties, she pulled up her tablet. The Vreth will bring a ceremonial guard of 20, standard for Vrethian diplomatic functions. 20, I said. Marethians will bring 12, they always bring 12, it's a cultural thing. Selthari will bring 6, Tharvens will bring 8. She scrolled. Each party also has the right to request enhanced security protocols, which means some of their personnel will be positioned in adjacent corridors and access points. And us. She looked at me. Rella, how many people is Declan bringing? 4, she said. I stared at her. 4, I said. He requested 4, I approved 4. Director Ose approved 4. The council approved 4. We're bringing 4 security personnel to a gathering where the Vreth are bringing 20, and we're one of the 5 dominant parties being formally acknowledged. Yes, Rella said. Is that? It's deliberate, she said. And before you ask me to explain it, let me just say that I argued with him about it for an hour, and I still don't know if he's right or if he's going to give me a heart attack, but the logic is sound. What's the logic? She set down her tablet. The number of personnel you bring to a convening is a statement. 30 personnel says, we are threatened by this gathering and we need protection. 4 personnel says, we are not. I thought about that. 4 personnel, and one of them is Declan Ward, I said. Yes, Rella said, which is apparently a different kind of statement. The first day of the convening went smoothly, which in retrospect was the universe being polite before it got interesting. The ceremonial hall on Level 2 was vast enough that all 5 delegations had significant space without crowding. The Vrethian delegation had stationed their 20 guards in a formal ring around their seating section, visible, disciplined, deeply impressive in the way that 20 Vrethian warriors in dress armor always was. The Marethians had their 12 in 2 neat columns. The Selthari had arranged their 6 in a pattern that I later learned was a traditional formation indicating peaceful gathering. The Tharvens had positioned their 8 in a cluster that, to my untrained eye, looked casual but which Oveshmurin later told me was a specific ceremonial arrangement that communicated cooperative intent. The T-section had 4 people. Declan was one. The other 3 were members of his security unit, all of them experienced, none of them small, but 4 is 4. They were standing in a loose, easy grouping near the T delegation seating section, not in any particular formation, talking quietly among themselves occasionally, looking around the hall with the calm, steady attention that I'd come to think of as characteristically Declan, transferred to the wider unit. I watched the other delegations notice this. It took about 20 minutes, subtle at first, a Vrethian guard whose attention drifted toward the T section and then back, a Myrethian security officer who murmured something to the one next to him, one of the Selthari whose body language communicated curiosity without being obvious about it. But the clearest signal was from the Vrethian delegation directly. Garrick Stometh was there. Of course he was. He was the senior military representative for the Vrethian hegemony at the convening. Their participation in this gathering had required sending someone of appropriate rank, and in Vrethian terms, rank was demonstrated by combat classification. Garrick Stometh was, therefore, the appropriate person. He looked at the T-section's 4 personnel with the same expression, or whatever the Vrethian equivalent of an expression was. It was hard to read their faces that he'd had in the corridor. That pause, that recalibration. And I realized, watching him, that the calculation he was running was the same one his entire civilization had been running since the Thresh Passage. The same calculation that had produced, at the end of 2 engagements and a lengthy assessment period, the same answer every time. The Vreth had not challenged humanity again. Not because they couldn't, not because the galaxy had stopped them, because their own logic, their own 2,000 years of hard-won combat intelligence had told them not to. And here, in the ceremonial hall of Cathara Station, at the first convening that included humanity as a recognized dominant party, Garrick Stometh the Unbroken looked at 4 humans standing casually near their delegation seating section and understood, with the absolute clarity of a great warrior who knows what he is seeing, exactly what that number meant. It meant, we know what you're capable of, and we're not adjusting our posture accordingly. It meant 4 is enough. Not as a boast, not as a challenge. As a statement of fact. The formal proceedings of the convening took 2 days and covered boundary acknowledgments, resource lane protocols, and a series of mutual recognition agreements that were, in their specifics, deeply technical and not particularly dramatic. But on the evening of the second day, something happened that was none of those things. The convening's evening sessions were informal, not part of the official proceedings, but a traditional opportunity for delegations to interact outside the formal structure. Food and drink appropriate to each species' requirements were available. Translation collars were set to social rather than formal mode. It was, in the way that the galaxy has developed over centuries of multi-species diplomacy, a party. I was there as an extended member of the T delegation, logistics coordinator, observer, the person who knew where everything was and could solve problems before they became problems. I was watching the room when the Vrethian sub-commander, not Garrick Stometh himself, one of his senior warriors, walked over to the T-section. The warrior's name translated as Strength of Many Victories, which was a Vrethian naming convention that described the bearer's combat record. He was, by Vrethian standards, young, perhaps 35 years old, which meant he had been fighting for 15 or 20 years, and was already at senior warrior rank. He was about 7 feet, broad, in the ceremonial version of Vrethian dress armor, which was somewhat less alarming than the full combat configuration, but still not something you wanted to walk into unexpectedly in a corridor. He walked up to where Declan was standing. Declan was holding a cup of whatever the tea had brought as their beverage contribution to the evening's proceedings. It was coffee. We'd brought real coffee, which had immediately generated considerable interest from at least 3 other delegations, and talking with Cassandra Fenn about something that looked low stakes. He saw strength of many victories approaching. His expression didn't change. The Vrethian warrior stopped in front of him. There was a moment of the kind of silence that spreads outward from a central point, where people in the immediate vicinity sense that something is happening and adjust their attention without quite knowing why. "You are the garrison commander," the warrior said. "I am," Declan said, same answer as in the corridor. "You have served," the warrior said. It wasn't a question, it was a specific Vrethian formulation that I recognized from the briefing files. A request for a combat record. "I have," Declan said. At Thresh Passage, a faint ripple through the room. Several members of other delegations who had been listening peripherally were now listening more directly. "No," Declan said, "not at Thresh, other engagements." The warrior processed this. "You did not fight at Thresh." "I didn't. But you know those who did." "Some of them," Declan said. A pause. The warrior's translator collar rendered his next words with a formality that suggested they were chosen carefully. "My forces engaged yours twice." Another pause. "I do not say this as challenge or grievance, I say it as record." "I know," Declan said. "At the Thresh Passage, the first engagement, 3 of my unit survived, of 46 who entered that engagement." The warrior's voice had shifted slightly. Not emotional, exactly. Vrethians weren't emotional in the human sense. But careful, precise, as if he was counting something. "In the second engagement, 11 survived, of 60. The room was very quiet now. "I'm sorry about your people," Declan said. Another pause, longer. "This is your custom," the warrior said, "to express regret for fallen opponents." "It's something we do, yes," Declan said. "Among my people," Strength of Many Victories said, "an opponent who defeats you and then expresses regret over your fallen, this is either a profound insult or—" He paused again, and I had the impression he was working through a translation problem that his collar couldn't fully solve. "There is no direct word, an acknowledgement of worth. A recognition that those who were lost were worthy to have been opposed by you." "That's closer to what I meant," Declan said. The warrior stood very still for a moment. Then he did something that I had never seen a Vrethian do before, and that Oveshmuran, watching from the Tharven section with his bioluminescence cycling through colors I'd never seen on him, later told me he had also never seen. He placed his right hand flat, open against his chest. The left hand came up to rest above it. A gesture. "The Kethral acknowledges you," he said, "by name if you will give it." Declan Ward gave his name. The warrior repeated it, not an approximation, the actual name carefully rendered. "Declan Ward," he said. "The Kethral acknowledges you." Then he stepped back, turned, and returned to the Vrethian section. The room was quiet for another 3 or 4 seconds. Then conversation resumed.